Hello, good evening, and welcome to another session of COP-OFF, DiEM25's Alternative Climate Conference. This session is titled Same Storm, Different Boats, the Global South. So we're going to talk about the Global South in this session. I'm Lucas Febraro, and I'm joined tonight by two wonderful guests. Originally scheduled to be three wonderful guests, but Congresswoman Joenia Wapichana from Brazil unfortunately is unable to attend tonight. Regardless, we have two great guests, and I'd like to introduce them now. Our first guest is a human rights lawyer and a PhD candidate at Warwick Law School, where her research focuses on climate justice. Earlier this year, she co-founded Tipping Point UK to support grassroots groups to build power for systems change, and has contributed and written to many publications, including Perspectives on a Global Green New Deal. Harpreet K Paul, welcome, Harpreet.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Our second guest is the co-chair of the Left Group in the European Parliament and the co-founder of the Intergroup on the Green New Deal. She has lectured human rights at Sciences Po Paris and was previously a spokeswoman at Oxfam France and a tax justice campaigner, a cause that she has continued to champion as a member of the European Parliament. Manon Aubry, welcome, Manon. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, everyone. Thanks.
Okay, so let's get right into it. I would like to ask a couple of opening questions, one for each of you. Starting with you, Harpreet. A very short and basic one. Why is it that we need to think the climate crisis and climate change globally? Why is it that national plans and national solutions at the national level are not enough?
A short question with a very long answer that could probably take up the entire space, but I'll try and be as succinct as possible. We all woke up this morning, and some of us would have made ourselves a cup of tea or coffee. We would have likely checked our phones. And within those first few moments, we were confronted with a globalized world, whether it's the places in which the things that we eat are grown and harvested and move across borders, or the minerals that make up the batteries in our phones and laptops that are then shipped to usually Southeast Asia and then North Asia or Eastern Europe. The global is in our daily lives. And the food industry is not only responsible for a quarter of greenhouse gases, but also implicated in deforestation, workers' rights abuses, and the system with neoliberal globalization, which enables workers in our supply chains to be disregarded, workers, particularly in the mining industry, to potentially be working in conditions of modern slavery, child labor, is a system that allows corporations to treat workers in that way, but also avoid tax in local jurisdictions and extract resources. So Global Justice Now research suggests that the African continent experiences something like $40 billion more being extracted from it, the level of remittances, aid, and loans that are provided to it. So in that kind of very basic sense, we can't avoid the global in our daily life. How does that connect to the climate crisis? If a country like Mozambique, which experienced 2 unprecedentedly strong storms and is paying significant amounts of money in loan repayments, is not getting a fair level of tax paid to its economy, hasn't received any rebuild following storms, then we are seeing very clearly how economic precarity, neoliberal globalization, and climate are confronted while I'm speaking, we've got 500,000 children in Madagascar under the age of 5 experiencing climate in 300,000 people this year being impacted by floods in the DRC. And the average person in the UK, where I'm currently based, emits something like 5 times more than the average person in Madagascar, 65 times more emissions than the average person in the DRC. And so the global, in terms of climate injustice and economic injustice, has to be very central to however we think about new deals.
Thank you, Harpreet. And the question for you, Manon. You work at the belly of the beast, if you allow me the provocative expression. You're a member of the European Parliament. You spend a lot of time in Brussels. Well, the European Union, they have a European Green Deal, and that sounds wonderful. We talk a lot about the Green New Deal. How much of a difference can a word make? The word new. So, what is it that, in your opinion, is being done, if anything, in Brussels currently in order to make sure that some of those structural inequalities are addressed? What is it that isn't being done, and what is it that you and your parliamentary group is pushing for?
Well, it actually does make all of the difference, and it's good that you noticed that the word new is missing, because precisely the way they see the climate issue at Brussels and EU level, and when I say they, is like the liberals that are governing in the European Union, is to try to save the planet with old recipes, with old free trade agreements, with old austerity rules, with old agricultural productive financial support, etc. And I could go on for quite a while, actually, with fossil fuels, etc. So indeed, it's not enough to package it. It's not enough to take old policies and say, look, this is a great Green New Deal. I mean, Green Deal. This is a great Green Deal, because actually they refuse to question the same policies that are actually leading to the current climate situation we're in, and the terrible consequences that we are going to face. If you just take, and that might be something we're going to discuss later, but basically the Green Deal of the European Union lies on what we call a Fit for 55 package. So I'll explain it. So first off, they made us vote an objective of a reduction of 55% CO2 emission by 2030. One might think that this is ambitious, but as often, the devil is in the details. First, because that objective of minus 55% is not even in the trajectory we would need to meet the Paris Agreement, would make a target of 65%. So we're way below this with the 65. Second of all, actually they made a little bit of mathematical trick in calculating it, because they're actually not taking into account the impact and consequences of imported CO2 emissions. So when you import a product, the environmental impact it has. So it's one way to sort of externalize the pollution, which obviously doesn't change the overall impact that is massive. And thirdly, even though that objective would not be sufficient, they're actually not meeting it, precisely because there isn't a fundamental change in the EU core policies that I've been mentioning just before. So most experts agree that the EU will not even be able to meet that objective of 55%. And the main reason of this is precisely because there isn't a big shift in the EU policies, the one that are responsible of most climate change impact, being, transport, being the type of energy that we're using, being the agricultural policy. Once again, in just 1 week, we are going to vote the European agricultural policy that is the main budget at EU level. And guess what? Well, we are going to vote the same old agricultural policy that support massive agro-industrial type of of lands and of production that is obviously very that has a lot of climate impact. And the policy that we're going to vote is for the next 6 years, so it does jeopardize our future for the next 6 years at least. And when you think that it's the main budget of the European Union and we're not able to make it climate compatible, then there's lots to worry. So in short, the EU is very good at words, and it's very good at making those very nice, speeches, being the president of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen. We need to save the planet. We need to think about the future. We need to think about the youth, blah, blah, blah. But actually not very good at meeting the discourse with the EU policies, unfortunately.
Yeah, and I find it interesting that you mentioned the tax on imports proposal in the Fit for 55 plan, which has been criticized a lot for the reasons that you mentioned, in sort of deflecting the responsibility towards the people who, the regions of the world that are the most affected by climate change, first of all, and that also without financial support are the least capable of complying to such regulations. And coming from the global south, coming from Brazil more specifically, I know that there is this pervasive sort of mentality, even among the left, that sort of takes offense at this hypocrisy, right? So even though some, among progressives, you understand that climate change is real and that it's here, but at the same time, you see the hypocrisy in it, basically, and you tend to be averse at this sort of like moralizing that the global north tends to do sometimes, especially institutions such as the EU. I remember, there are even myths when I was growing up that in American school textbooks, the Amazon was shown as an international sort of territory. So it was not Brazilian territory at all. Of course, it's not real, but it sort of exemplifies that mentality. So my question is, how is it that we overcome that? How is it that not only at a policy level, but also at the communications level? And I know that both of you have experience and ideas in that. Of course, you, Manon, you are a founding member of the Global Alliance for a Green New Deal. And I'm sure that you've had a lot of exchanges with congresspeople from the Global South on that, and how you can unify not only at the policy level, but also at the message level, so that people can get on board in the Global South as well.
Yeah, and I think it's very key and very important, because we tend to do, in some of the richest countries, we tend to do policies that are completely disconnected from the reality, completely disconnected from the impact on the ground, and in particular in certain countries. So one of the objectives and one of the reasons why we put together this Global Alliance is precisely to join forces, but also to adopt a common narrative that will be a stronger, in all places of the world. In particular, for example, you were talking about Brazil, bringing in the voices from Brazil whenever we discuss the free trade agreements with Mercosur, that will definitely have a primary impact in Brazil, and that sometimes, it's not true for everyone, obviously, but sometimes some of the colleagues in the European Parliament don't really, measure the impact on the ground. So bringing in the voices from the South, I think, is also really key. And It was key as well for the last COP, without the success we could have hoped for. But it's very key to have them on board at every stage, because it help us keeping in mind the priority, the trajectory that we're aiming for. Because sometimes, when, especially at the EU level, when there's this culture of compromises, when there's this culture of, oh, you negotiate, I do a step, you do a step, and to be honest, being in the EU bubble and coming from the the activist world, the so-called activist world, and coming from NGOs, sometimes, I'm sitting in these rooms and I'm like, what do you actually know what you're talking about? It's just like, it feels like, okay, I do one step in your direction, you do one step in my directions, completely losing the reason why we're doing it and what is going to make a difference. And it's just like my frustration that I'm bringing in there, and sorry for being one way to outsource my frustration, but is that culture of compromise, I think, is killing every potential ambition when it comes to tackling climate change. And here is not about who's right or who's wrong. It's about what are the means to ensure that we stay below the 1.5 degrees trajectory. And if you take the commitments from last week COP, it's actually 2.4. Warming of 2.5 at global level, it means that there are places in the world that are literally going to be underwater, that will be more floodings, that will be a whole agricultural sector will be damaged, everything will be damaged. And for sure some countries are going to face more the consequences than others. And so only a global movement, with strong voices from both the global north and the global south, will help, I think, challenging the ones that are trying to convince themselves, and I have no other explanation, that they're trying to convince themselves that they're acting while actually they're making us losing time.
A quick note before I ask basically the same question to Harpreet. The comments on our YouTube chats were disabled, but if they're disabled for you, you just have to refresh your page and then they will be enabled. And then please feel free to throw your questions at us as well, that we can then pose to our guests. Harpreet, on the same topic, I think Manon gave us a great overview as to how her experience is at the institutional level. I think you also had a very interesting perspective to that at a different level. So I know that you have this sort of vision with regards to the different struggles that working class people and poor people face in the global north and in the global south, that are sometimes overlooked even by progressive voices, and how to draw those connections and to build solidarity there. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I think to start, there is at the core of this conversation a real equity issue. The global north has used up about 60% of the carbon budget if we're serious about trying to reach 1.5 degrees, which is absolutely essential to aim for. The difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees is the difference between 2 billion people more being subjected to heat stress, for example, alone, let alone the other impacts on sea level rise and other impacts. But a lot of the dynamics which increase vulnerability and which bring countries from the global south to climate summits asking for enhanced climate finance is the equity issue, sure, but it's also, you're increasingly hearing countries talk about the ways in which finance systems also increase precarity. So starting with an example from the global south, last year Zambia missed 2 consecutive repayments on its Eurobond debts. Its credit rating was downgraded and the IMF refused to implement a bailout unless the country agreed a new economic program. And following its default, Zambia's had to allocate 44% of annual government revenue to its creditors. And the Jubilee Debt Campaign has estimated that some banks are making something like 250% profit on Zambian bonds. Meanwhile, 1 in 2 Zambian people live below the global extreme poverty line of just $1.90 a day. And, we're talking about a context where the global 1% are contributing double the emissions of 50% of the population. So there's obviously, extreme economic climate injustices. The fact that Zambia has to allocate nearly 50% of its revenue to creditors means that it can't invest in transitions. It can't invest in the climate resilience that would help it address climate change impacts that are already underway, let alone the health infrastructure that's needed to address the immediate pandemic. And a lot of these dynamics are replicated within the global north as well. So a piece that I recently wrote for Open Democracy took the example of Britain's banks. Barclays, for example, not only one of the biggest investors in fossil fuel infrastructure in Europe, the biggest in Europe, in fact, after the 2008 financial crash, it lent a number of local authorities within the UK loans with interest rates linked to quite scandalous interference on the rates that they've got into quite a bit of trouble for. But again, it meant that some local authorities within the UK were paying more in interest payments to Barclays than they were able to invest in domestic violence shelters, in housing, in retrofitting schemes, in youth centres. So part of the work that we're trying to do at Tipping Point is to connect the financial industry as one of the root drivers of investments in fossil fuel infrastructure and in driving precarity as well. And we did that a couple of weeks ago on the 29th of October with protests starting outside the Lloyd's of London, which is in fact an insurance company, by the way, that also profited from the enslavement of African peoples and received compensation on the end of slavery and continues to invest in fossil fuel infrastructure through Indigenous territories in Australia and Canada today. And so our aim is really to look at home and say, how are the ways in which our institutions are continuing to exacerbate a crisis that the global north is categorically disproportionately responsible for? And how can we have these conversations of solidarity by leveraging the power that we have in relation to the institutions that exist here? So part of that work is in relation to banks and insurance companies, but the other part of it is speaking through Labour for a Green New Deal, for example, to municipalities, constituencies that are going to be buying electric car vehicles and saying, yes, we're not going to address the root causes of exploitation, labour, extractivism in the global south, but as a bare minimum, when local authorities, public purchasers within the UK buy green infrastructure, at a bare minimum, we should see procurement happening in compliance with human rights norms, International Labour Organization standards, and we've got good precedents on this from the Workers' Rights Consortium and Electronics Watch that have done this work for some time, and we're hoping to push institutions like the Transport for London to do some of this work as well.
Right. On a bit of a different topic now. Of course, COP26 just wrapped up, and the agreement was finalized after much wrangling. And one of the hot topics during the conference and during the negotiations for the agreement as well, which is becoming more and more sort of in vogue, especially from Global South voices, is the topic of reparations. Or, I'm sorry, I said the forbidden term, the topic of loss and damage, as it's called at negotiation tables. And it was, of course, there were many discussions about it during COP26, and eventually it was sort of like symbolically included into the final agreement, which I think the language that was used was something like a commitment to initiate a dialogue to talk about arrangements for funding of activities to avert, minimize, and address loss and damage, which to me sounds like peak communique speak. What are your views on that, Harpreet? Do you think that this can be a viable element in addressing those inequalities, those global inequalities?
I think that it's a start. Well, there's going to be a dialogue next year, and that's really the bare minimum that's necessary. There's an estimated $200 billion of loss and damage already experienced in the global south after storms hit. And that's likely to increase to between $280 to $590 billion by 2030. That's not that far away. And at the higher level, that amount is the equivalent in GDP of the 80 poorest countries in the world. So we're talking about a huge amount of loss and damage that's going to be experienced, most extremely by not only countries that are least responsible, but countries that have had regimes of neoliberal economic policies imposed on them, which has meant that resources, labor, materials have been extracted from these countries in unfair ways. Neoliberal austerity measures imposed on them as conditions for loans that's reduced their resilience with higher and higher proportions of their expenditure on repayments. So the issue is not only one that some people perceive as a political football, I think, unfairly, saying that global South countries bring this up with a view to not having to mitigate. And I think that's incredibly unfair, because the countries that have been leading in the negotiations are small island developing states who brought this issue up in 1992 before the Framework Convention was even signed. And they're the countries that have been insisting on 1.5 to stay alive and are now saying, actually, on the latest science, 1.5 is barely to survive. And they were the most powerful voices for this. And for them, it's consistently being brought forward as an existential issue that absolutely has to be repaired. And for the US and for a number of countries within the EU, it's unfortunately linked too closely to an idea of reparation or compensation, which is perceived as dangerous. But ultimately, countries need debts cancelled. They need space freed up within their economies to print money and not have that blocked by conditions of loans. And they need loss and damage climate financing, as well as pledges for past climate financing to transition and to adjust, also met. And without that, we're going to see COP negotiations completely poisoned on all three levels: mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage, unless the global north accepts their responsibility. As I said, 60% of the country used by 18% of the population in the global north, that continues on a per capita basis to be grossly responsible for emissions. And unless that core justice issue is met, we're going to continue to see a kind of game being played by more powerful global south countries. And that is unfortunate, but I think at the core of it, the justice demands from small island developing states and least developed countries has to be responded to in a meaningful way if we're going to see progress.
Right. And when we talk about how to finance transitions across the globe, obviously, debt cancellation, those reparations as well, those things are all helpful and fine and well. But I know that from your perspective, Manon, something that you've campaigned for a long time, and that's one of the most prominent topics in your work as a parliamentarian as well, is the is the issue of taxation. And so if you would argue that these actions are not enough, that taxation needs to play an essential part in it as well. First of all, do you agree with that? And why is it that we can't propose a well-encompassing solution without talking about taxation as well?
Well, I mean, taxation is key in sort of two ways. One is, if we don't lie to people, adapting ourselves to climate change and changing our economic system does cost money. But the good news is we can have that money. The question is whether we want to collect it. But clearly, if you want to change your energy sector and your energy system and invest, for example, to have an objective 100% of renewable energies, if you want to change your agricultural sector, etc., this costs some money, or at least some initial investment. So that's the first role of a well-functioning tax system is, first of all, to collect the money that we need to make the transition. And the second thing is related to the social distribution of climate change impact, and also the different responsibilities that different people have. In short, and I'm sure everyone knows this, that obviously, the ways of life of the poorest people, is definitely having less impact on climate than the way of life of richest people. If I want to put it simply and caricature a little bit, Jeff Bezos, when he goes, in the space, I don't have the word in English, but you followed this. I don't have the exact data in mind, but it's the equivalent of like millions of people's life impact of climate change. And it's just like we're talking about a few minutes of Jeff Bezos' life compared to millions of people. Obviously, this is a bit more nuanced than this, because not everyone is Jeff Bezos. But if you take overall at global level, the 10%, the 10 richest percent are responsible of half of the CO2 emissions at global level. Meaning that the role of the tax system as well, by redistributing wealth, is also to minimize initially the climate impact of the way of life of the richest people that have an impact on climate change. So with this kind of in two ways, the tax system is very key for a fair transition. The question is, are we willing to change our tax system? And that's why we've been pushing, the whole of the Tax the Rich campaign. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez as well in the US is pushing that agenda, and we're many across the world. And it's not only about money. It's not only about fighting inequalities, but it's also about fighting climate change. And actually, those two issues, climate change and inequalities, are the two sides of the same coin. And by fighting inequalities, you fight climate change, and vice versa. So that's why we cannot have a Green New Deal that doesn't come with a fair tax system, meaning taxing more the richest, introducing wealth tax, because there are very few countries in the world that have wealth tax, etc. But also having a much more efficient action against tax dodging, which is one way also for the richest to hide money in the tax havens and not paying their fair share of taxes. And to that extent, the latest deal that has been done at international level on a global minimum effective tax rate of 15% is very low. It's just above the rate of Ireland, which is 12.5%, which is one of the most well-known tax haven. It does include also some possibilities to decrease that rate. I'm not going to go into the technical details there, but there's been a race to the bottom at global level, with the average effective tax rate of companies being divided by 2 in the last 20 years. And the tax havens are going to sort of win the competition by actually taking everyone down to their level. And when we do that, it means that we're offering the possibilities of the richest, for the richest, but also for some of the large multinationals not to pay their fair share of taxes, and therefore depriving states of essential funds to actually help them fight climate change, help them adapt on one hand, and on the other hand, change the economic system to ensure that we drastically diminish our climate impact. So for all of those reasons, the finance issue is very important and is very often completely forgotten in all of the discussion, because it does touch one of the key aspects of our current societies, which is the distribution of wealth and money, which is obviously very sensible because there's lots of people that are trying to protect their interests there.
Right, thank you, Manon. And we have a question from our audience, a very strongly worded question from our audience. The financial and economic system we live under is frankly ecocidal and managed and maintained by eco-pathological, insane members of our species. How can we remove those influences? Who wants to take that one? Harpreet,
I will say some things. I'm not sure if I'll answer. I'm not sure if I'll answer the question exactly. So apologies in advance if I don't. I think the systems that expose people that are least responsible for climate change are the same systems that are responsible for economic precarity, and how we remove those forces, I guess, is a question that different people respond to in different ways. And in Glasgow recently, I was helping to facilitate an assembly on climate reparations, and there were lots of interventions made to the effect that this is actually a system that's been going on for over 500 years, a system that viewed certain places and peoples as resources to be extracted. And in his book, The Memory We Could Be, Daniel Voska-Boynik, summarizes this very cogently by saying ecocide came hand in hand with ethnocide as whole landscapes changed to kind of make way for plantations with slave labor. And a lot of the extractivism that is central to green transitions that are promoted even by well-meaning people within the North have the risk of replicating some of these dynamics, because they are conversations that are within this current system. And that's one of the things that influenced Dalia and I to co-edit this book with over 30 people. That's available for free, kindly, from the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation at www.global-gnd.com. But in it, there are lots of interventions which say that if we don't address the root of this system, we're going to see proposals to not only promote fanciful technology, as we're already seeing in net zero proposals, carbon capture and storage, which is untested and potentially very problematic, bioengineering, which views spacious land in the global south that's actually needed, for tree planting, again, in ways that are often very unhelpful to local communities because they're water intensive, monocultures not native and implicated in displacement, but also proposals that view the Middle East as empty land for solar panels, ripe for renewable energy to be created, and all sorts of proposals to have pipelines linking that energy system to Europe. And there's an example that Hamza Hamouchen gives specifically in relation to that in the book, from Western Sahara. And so I think we need to be creating movements that are, yes, capable of winning interim demands like progressive taxation. It's incredible the amount of wealth that the billionaires have made during the pandemic. And Oxfam analysis recently showed that a tiny tax on billionaires could pay for global access to vaccines and still leave billionaires more wealthy than they were than before the pandemic. So yes, I think winning reforms like that is absolutely crucial. But I think as we do that, we need to be politicizing and engaging in public education like this event, and others, where people know that that's not the end of the story. And ultimately, we need to move away from a system that creates billionaires while half the population that struggles to have access to water and food and housing. And I don't think there's an easy answer to the question, how? My answer is pick a campaign, run it successfully, bring people into your movement, through it, have these conversations so that once you've won, you can pick a bolder demand. And some analysis says we need 3.5% of people actively engaged in campaigns to mobilize 25% of people to win transformative changes. And that might sound like a huge number. In the UK, it's about 2.4 million active organizers. But once you take it down to your local level, if you imagine, as I'm sitting in Oxford, it's a couple of thousand people. And we recently had a couple of hundred people come out to an event around housing precarity in Oxford. So if we can connect these struggles, talk about how housing precarity here shouldn't exist. A small tax could pay for retrofitting and insulation, reduce fuel poverty, reduce the amount of people that die as a result of not being able to pay their fuel bills, address the rent crisis, and address climate change. And there's ways of bringing these issues together. So run a campaign, link it to climate change, because everything needs to change. So everything will be related to climate change, and increase your members by not shaming people for not understanding how everything's connected when they walk into your campaign, and actually make them feel welcome and part of a bigger struggle, and be bolder as we win reforms along the way.
Right, thank you, Harpreet. And it's fitting that as we move towards the end, we've struck this more hopeful tone. So I'm going to give a chance for Manon here to do the same. Manon, we talked about a lot of issues, obviously a lot of things that need to change, but from your perspective, at the national level in France, and also obviously at the European level, since you are a member of the European Parliament, are you hopeful that we can address these issues? Many people aren't. Are you?
Yeah, I'm full of hope, otherwise I wouldn't be there. Yeah, I've been working, you mentioned it, for Oxfam before being elected to the European Parliament. And I would define myself just as an activist. And I'm still an activist even now as a member of the European Parliament. And when I was approached by actually a few political parties to run for the European election, my initial intuition was just to say no, like, this is not my world. I don't believe we're going to change anything. And I was kind of skeptical. But then when I thought about it, and when I thought about years of struggle and years of frustration as well, because when you're an activist, you get frustrated because you have the impression that you win the hearts of people, but don't win the policies. And there are things that become consensual in the population, but still are not implemented at policy level. And, ask myself, do I think that we're going to convince Emmanuel Macron, Boris Johnson, or Bolsonaro from one day to another to really care about climate change, to change our economic system, to redistribute wealth? Well, actually, no. I don't, as much as I like my work of doing campaigning and advocacy, and it was my work to try to convince them, let's be realistic. I don't think we're going to ever convince them. But what makes me hopeful is actually that we replace them. That all of us, even though we believe, and I know that's a question that is really high at the moment in the youth climate movement. You know, what's the relationship with the political world? And I'm not going to say that's a fantastic world. I'm not going to say I'm loving it every single day. I'm just going to say there are other ways to change the lives of people. And I say this to all potential activists, to all the ones that care a little or a lot about our planet, about the way wealth is distributed, and that believe, like me, that we're not going to convince our current political leaders, then we just need to replace them. And to replace them, well, we need to invest ourselves into politics. And there are many ways to do it. I'm not saying all of us should be representative and should be elected members of parliaments, etc. But I think we need to take over. And it's time to take over. We're a young generation of activists who are, you know, we've framed our society, and we share a lot of concerns. We share a lot of the solutions. And the last reason why I'm hopeful, and I'll try to leave you on this because then I'll have to rush, but it's not like we don't have the solutions. You know, at the beginning of the COVID crisis, there were room not to be so hopeful because there were no vaccine at the time. But now there can be room to be helpful because we do have the vaccines. The question is to what extent we can produce enough of those vaccines and to what extent we can distribute them to the whole world and not only to the richest countries. The same goes for wealth distribution. The same goes for climate change. We do have the solutions. We do know how we would do it. I'm not saying it's going to be easy, but we do know it. The question is whether we do manage to implement them. And to implement them, well, there's no other solution that take back the power for those who are blocking it at the moment. And those who are blocking at the moment were the ones, I mean, a lot of the ones that were gathering in the COP26 last week in the room. They're the ones that are gathering, you know, in the EU Council. And I'm just hoping today that all of those activists that are at the moment in the street, they're actually the one, you know, taking the decisions. And this would change a lot of things. So I'm trying to leave you on that optimistic note.
And on that wonderful note, we're going to wrap up. If you enjoyed this talk, we want to know what you think so that we can discuss that together in our cup of talks. We're going to talk about how we can transform some of the things discussed in those sessions into policy measures. The link will be pasted in the chat now, and we hope to see you there. I want to thank again Manon Aubry and Harpreet K Paul for joining us. Stay tuned for our next session with Yanis Varoufakis, Noam Chomsky, and Anne Pettifor at 8 p.m. Central European Time. And see you next time.